The bell above the cafe door had chimed 1,000 times that morning, but the chime that made Dante Moretti's blood freeze was not the one that announced a customer. It was the soft three-part giggle that followed. 3 small laughs, layered like a chord, identical in pitch, identical in rhythm. He set his espresso cup down so slowly that the porcelain did not make a sound against the saucer, and he lifted his eyes. And there she was. 5 years gone. 5 years vanished. 5 years he had spent tearing apart 3 continents looking for a ghost. And she was standing 12 feet away from him, holding the hands of 3 little boys with jet black hair and eyes the exact color of storm clouds. His eyes, his hair, his jaw, softened by youth but unmistakable. 3 of them. Dante Moretti, the man they called the Silent King of the East Coast, the man whose name made hardened men whisper in cathedrals, felt his hand begin to tremble around the coffee cup. And Dante Moretti's hands never trembled. But before we understand what happened in that cafe, we must go back. We must go back to who Elena Russo was before the world tried to bury her, and who Dante Moretti was before he learned that the greatest weapon in his empire was not a gun, nor money, nor influence, but the memory of a woman who had once loved him without knowing what he truly was. Elena Russo had grown up in a small apartment above her grandmother's flower shop in a quiet corner of Brooklyn. She had never been the girl anyone noticed. She was soft where the world demanded sharp, curvy where the world demanded slender, quiet where the world demanded loud. Her cheeks were round and warm, her arms full, her hips wide, her frame generous in a way that made her wrap her cardigan tighter around herself every time she walked into a room full of thin women in tailored dresses. She had spent her whole life apologizing for taking up space, and the world had happily let her. At 23, she had taken a job as a junior florist at Aveline Blooms, a discreet, upscale floral studio, nestled between a private art gallery and a French patisserie in Manhattan. The shop served the kind of clientele who did not ask the price: diplomats, heiresses, and men in perfectly pressed black suits who never once removed their sunglasses. One of those men had walked in on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 years ago. He had not smiled. He had not offered his name. He had simply looked at her across the counter with dark, unreadable eyes and said, in a voice like slow-burning velvet, that he needed white peonies a dozen. Every Friday delivered to the same address. Elena had swallowed and nodded and written the order in her neat, careful handwriting. And she had tried very hard not to notice how impossibly handsome he was, how his shoulders filled the doorway, how the small silver ring on his little finger bore a crest she did not recognize, but somehow felt she should fear. That was the first time Elena Russo met Dante Moretti, though she did not know his last name for another 2 months, and she did not know what that last name meant for another 2 years. He came every Friday, then Wednesday, then Monday. He never bought the flowers for a woman, at least none that Elena could discern, because the address he gave was always the same, and it was a nursing home in Queens where she would later learn his elderly aunt lived alone with dementia and a fondness for white blooms. Elena had thought, in her quiet, uncertain way, that any man who bought his aunt flowers 3 times a week could not possibly be as cold as he seemed. And so, when he lingered one Friday evening and asked her, in that same slow-burning voice, if she would perhaps have dinner with him, she had said yes before her fear could catch up with her mouth. They had dated for 11 months. 11 months of small private dinners in restaurants that always seemed to be empty when they arrived. 11 months of long drives along the coast in a car with tinted windows. 11 months of Dante Moretti sitting across from her, saying almost nothing, but watching her as though she were the only living thing in the room. Elena had never in her life been looked at that way. She had never in her life felt beautiful. And she had, foolishly, terrifyingly, fallen in love. She never told him. She never quite dared. Because Dante Moretti was a man made of silences, and every time she tried to speak the word love, it died in her throat. Then, on a rainy night in the 11th month, everything shattered. She had gone to his penthouse to surprise him with a small dinner. She had cooked herself badly, but with love. She had used the key he had pressed into her palm 3 weeks before. She had stepped out of the elevator and heard voices. In the study. Men's voices. Angry voices. And Dante's calm and terrifyingly quiet, saying words she did not understand about shipments and territories and a man named Vittorio, who would be handled by morning. She had frozen in the hallway. She had listened. Wow. And then she had heard something that made her knees give out beneath her. A gunshot, muffled, contained. Followed by silence and then Dante's voice, still calm, still velvet, saying only, "Take him out through the service elevator." Elena had not screamed. She had not moved. She had stood there in the dark hallway, clutching her small bag of groceries, and she had understood in one terrible instant that the man she loved was not who she thought he was. That the flowers, the dinners, the empty restaurants, the tinted windows, all of it had been the softened edge of something monstrous. She had turned. She had walked to the elevator. She had gone home. And in the morning, before the sun rose, Elena Russo had packed one suitcase, emptied her small savings account, and vanished. She had not left a note. She had not answered a call. She had disappeared into the wide, forgiving anonymity of a country that did not know her name, and she had promised herself she would never look back. She had not known, when she boarded that bus to a small town in coastal Maine, that she was 3 weeks pregnant. She had not known that she was carrying, not one child, but 3. And she had not known that Dante Moretti, upon discovering her absence, would spend the next 5 years of his life, turning every stone on earth, trying to find her. The boys were born in a small hospital in Portland the following June. 3 of them. Identical. Perfect. She had named them Luca, Matteo, and Nico, after her grandfather, her father, and the saint her grandmother had prayed to every night. She had raised them alone, in a 2-bedroom apartment above a bakery, working as a floral designer for weddings, taking in extra sewing, tutoring high school students in Italian. In the evenings, she had built a life. A small, quiet, exhausted life. And she had never, not once, spoken their father's name aloud. Until that morning, that impossible morning, when she had come to New York for the first time in 5 years, only for a single day, only to meet with a specialty flower supplier about a wedding contract, and had stopped into a small cafe on the Upper East Side to buy the boys hot chocolates. She had not known he would be there. She had not known that this cafe, which had been a bookstore 5 years ago, was now owned by a shell company that traced through 11 layers of paperwork back to Moretti Holdings. She had not known that Dante Moretti sat in that same corner booth every morning at 9 o'clock sharp, and had done so for 4 years, because it was the last place he had seen her walking on the sidewalk outside the day before she vanished. She looked up, and her eyes met his. The cafe went silent, not because anyone else noticed. The other customers kept chattering. The barista kept steaming milk. But for Elena Russo and for Dante Moretti, the world stopped turning. His eyes moved from her face, down to the 3 small boys clutching her hands. 3 small boys with his black hair and his gray eyes. 3 small boys who could not have been anyone else's. Elena felt her heart stop. She felt the ground tilt. She felt every terrible thing she had run from crash back into her body at once. And then, because she was still Elena Russo, Still the woman who apologized for taking up space. She did the only thing she could think to do. She turned. She gathered her boys. And she began to walk very quickly toward the door. Dante rose from his booth. He did not shout. He did not run. He simply rose, and in one smooth motion, he lifted a single finger. And every man in that cafe who had appeared, until that moment, to be an ordinary customer, a jogger reading the paper, a businessman on his phone, a woman with a laptop, quietly stood up as well. Elena did not see them. She saw only the door. She pushed it open. She stepped out onto the sidewalk with her 3 boys, and she began to walk, then to hurry, then to run. Though running, with 3 4-year-olds, was less a run than a determined stumble. She had made it to the corner of the block when a black car glided to the curb beside her. The passenger window slid down. And there, in the back seat, calm as death, sat Dante Moretti. "Elena," he said. She stopped. She could not help it. His voice still had that same slow-burning velvet, that same terrifying gentleness. She turned her head to him, and she saw that his face, that impossibly handsome, terrifyingly calm face, was no longer calm at all. It was pale. His jaw was tight. His hands, folded in his lap, were shaking. "Get in the car," he said. "Please. Please." She had never heard him say please. In 11 months she had never once heard him say that word. She looked down at her boys. Luca, the oldest, by 3 minutes, was staring at Dante with wide, curious eyes. Matteo, the quiet one, was hiding behind her leg. Nico, the bold one, the one who reminded her most painfully of the man in the car, was pointing at him and saying, in his small, clear voice, "Mama, that man looks like me." Elena closed her eyes. She felt tears rise hot and unstoppable. And she understood that she could not run. Not this time. Not anymore. She opened the door. She helped her boys in. She climbed in after them. And Dante Moretti's driver pulled away from the curb. For a long moment, no one spoke. The 3 boys sat in a row on the wide leather seat, buckled in by Dante himself, who had knelt in the footwell of his own car, and fastened each of their belts with hands that would not stop shaking. Elena had watched him do it in silence. She had watched the way his eyes lingered on each small face. She had watched the way he touched the top of Nico's head just once, very lightly, as though he were afraid the boy might disappear. Then he had sat down opposite her, and the car had begun to move. 5 years, he said at last. His voice was low. It was not angry. It was not even accusing. It was simply broken. "I know," she whispered. 5 years, Elena. I looked everywhere. I know you had my sons." He said it not as a question, but as a fact, laid gently on the seat between them like a piece of shattered glass. She could not answer. She could only nod. And then, because her voice would no longer hold, she said, "I heard you. That night, in the study. I heard the gunshot." Dante closed his eyes. "I know what you are," she whispered. "I know what you do. And I could not raise my sons in a house where men are shot. In the study, Dante. I could not. I am sorry. I am so sorry." He opened his eyes. And Elena saw, for the first time in the 7 years she had known him, that Dante Moretti was crying, not sobbing, just 2 silent tears, moving slowly down that impossibly composed face. "The man in the study," he said, "was not shot, Elena. He was a business rival, who had threatened my aunt. The sound you heard was a bottle of wine that I threw against the wall in anger. I have never killed a man in my home. I have never killed a man in front of a woman I love. And I have never, not once, done anything that would put you in harm's way." Elena stared at him. She felt the world tilt again. "I am not," he said, "the monster you think I am. I am worse in some ways. I am better in others. I run an organization that operates in shadows my father built long before I was born. But I have spent my entire life trying to move that organization into the light, trying to make it clean. Trying to make it something my children could one day be proud of." He looked at the three boys. His voice cracked. "Something my children could inherit without shame." Elena covered her mouth with her hand. "I would have told you," he said. "I was going to tell you. That night, that very night, was the night I was going to tell you everything. I had the ring in my pocket, Elena. I had asked your grandmother's blessing 3 weeks before." Elena began to cry, silently. Uncontrollably the boys had gone very still, watching their mother. Watching this strange man across from her, understanding in the way that small children always understand that something enormous was happening. The car did not go to Dante's penthouse. It did not go to any of his offices. It went, instead, to a small brownstone on a quiet street in the West Village. A house Elena had never seen before, with white shutters and a small garden and a bright red door. Dante unlocked it himself. "This is your house," he said quietly. "I bought it 4 years ago. I have kept it ready. I did not know if you would ever come back, but I could not bear the thought that you might and have nowhere to go." Elena stepped inside. The house was warm. It smelled faintly of lavender. There was a nursery upstairs, she would later discover, painted in soft yellow, though it had been designed for 1 child, not 3. There were fresh flowers on the kitchen table. White peonies, a dozen of them, as though they had always been there, as though they had been waiting. Elena stood in the small foyer, with her 3 boys around her, and she wept. She wept for the 5 years she had spent alone. She wept for the man she had misjudged. She wept for the sons who had grown up without a father because she had been too frightened to ask a single question. And Dante Moretti stood a respectful distance away, his hands in his pockets. And he did not touch her. He simply waited. That night, after the boys had eaten sandwiches at the small kitchen table and asked Dante roughly 600 questions about his car and his ring and whether he had a dog, Elena tucked them into a single enormous bed upstairs because they refused to be separated, and she came back down to find Dante sitting on the couch in the living room, staring at nothing. She sat beside him, not touching, just near. "Why did you never remarry?" she asked. He turned his head. He looked at her with those unreadable dark eyes, and he said simply, "Because there was only one of you." Elena felt her chest crack open. They talked until dawn. She told him about the pregnancy, about Portland, about the small apartment above the bakery, about the boys' first steps and their first words, and the way Luca liked to draw, and Matteo liked to hum, and Nico liked to climb every piece of furniture in every room. Dante listened. He did not interrupt. He asked, at one point, very softly, whether she had ever been afraid, alone, with 3 infants. And when she said yes, he closed his eyes as though the answer. He told her in turn about the 5 years he had spent searching, about the private investigators, the connections he had leveraged, the countries he had traveled to, about the moment he had realized, 6 months into her disappearance, that she had been pregnant, because her doctor's office had received a routine follow-up call from a clinic in Maine, and his people had traced it. He had known. She had a child. He had not known. There were 3. He had chosen not to pursue her further, at that point, because he had understood that if she had run for a reason, and he would not drag her back into a life. She had rejected, he had only kept the house. And the flowers. And waited. Elena listened to all of this in silence. And when he was finished, she said very quietly, "I made a terrible mistake, Dante." "No," he said. "You made the only choice you could with what you knew. And I have spent 5 years understanding that." She looked at him. And for the first time in 5 years, Elena Russo allowed herself to feel something other than fear. She reached across the small distance between them, and she took his hand. His fingers closed around hers as though she were the last living thing in the world. The following weeks were a slow, careful unraveling of everything Elena had believed. Dante did not push, he did not demand. He came to the brownstone in the mornings before the boys woke, and he made coffee in the kitchen and read the paper at the small table. And when the boys tumbled downstairs in their pajamas, he greeted each of them by name and listened patiently to their small, chaotic reports of dreams and drawings and imagined adventures. The boys took to him with a bewildering ease. Nico, the bold one, called him Papa within 4 days, without asking anyone's permission. Luca, the eldest, watched him carefully for a full week before deciding, one afternoon, to climb into his lap during a bedtime story and fall asleep against his chest. Matteo, the quiet one, took the longest, but on the morning of the 10th day, he handed Dante a small drawing of 4 stick figures, 3 little ones and 1 tall one, holding hands beneath a lopsided sun, and said only, "That is us." Dante had folded the drawing very carefully and put it in the inner pocket of his suit jacket, and he had kept it there every day since. Elena watched all of this with a heart that felt, for the first time in 5 years, as though it were beginning to stitch itself back together. But not everything was gentle. Not everything was safe. Because Dante Moretti had enemies. And Dante Moretti, in the joy of finding his family, had allowed himself for just a few weeks to become slightly less vigilant than he should have been. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after Elena's return. A black sedan appeared on the corner of the brownstone street. It stayed for 2 hours. Then it was gone. Dante's driver, a man named Salvatore who had served the Moretti family for 20 years, reported it that same evening, quietly, over the phone. Dante's jaw tightened, but he said nothing to Elena. The second sign came a week later. A florist delivered a bouquet of white peonies to the brownstone. Elena, who had never ordered them, opened the small card. It read, in a handwriting she did not recognize, "Welcome home. Elena, we have missed you." She showed the card to Dante. His face went perfectly still. And Elena understood, in that same terrifying way she had once understood, the world was not what she thought it was, that something was very wrong. "Who?" she asked. "A ghost," he said quietly. "From my father's time." His name was Alessandro Bianca. He had been Dante's father's oldest rival, a man believed dead for over a decade, whose organization Dante had thought long since absorbed and neutralized. But Alessandro Bianchi was not dead. He had been waiting patiently for 20 years for the right moment. And that moment, apparently, had come when Dante Moretti's greatest weakness, the woman he loved, and the 3 sons he had not known existed, had walked back into his life. Dante tripled the security around the brownstone that same afternoon. He did not tell Elena the full extent of what he had done, because he did not want to frighten her. But every rooftop within 4 blocks had a man on it by nightfall. Every car that passed the street was logged. Every florist, every grocer, every mail carrier who came within 50 feet of the front door had been vetted by Dante's second-in-command, a lean, sharp-eyed man named Raphael Colombo, who had been Dante's best friend since childhood, and who now, seeing his boss so obviously in love with a woman and 3 small children, took it upon himself to make dry, gentle jokes about Dante's newfound softness at every possible opportunity. "You used to be terrifying," Raphael said one evening, watching Dante crouch on the floor of the brownstone's living room building, a fortress out of couch cushions with 3 shrieking 4-year-olds. Now look at you. You are a father. It is disgusting. Shut up, Raphael, Dante said without looking up. You have peony petals in your hair. I know. You are going to marry her, aren't you? Yes. Have you asked her yet? No. Are you going to? Yes. When? When she is ready. Raphael sighed, and poured himself a glass of wine, and watched his oldest friend in the world laugh, actually laugh, out loud. For the first time in 5 years, as Nico climbed onto his shoulders and declared himself king of the fortress. But even as the brownstone filled with laughter, the shadow outside was growing. Alessandro Bianchi was not a man who threatened. He acted. And on a cold Thursday morning in late November, Elena Russo left the brownstone with her 3 boys, to take them to a small park 2 blocks away, accompanied, she believed, only by Salvatore in the car behind her and 1 female bodyguard walking discreetly ahead. She did not know that 6 men were watching her from across the street. She did not know that a van was parked around the corner. And she did not know that Alessandro Bianchi had decided that morning that the fastest way to bring the silent king to his knees was to take from him the 4 people he loved most. All at once the van moved fast. Salvatore saw it first. He shouted into his earpiece. The female bodyguard drew a weapon. And Elena Russo, who had never in her life been in physical danger, turned and saw 4 men in dark coats running toward her and her sons. She did the only thing a mother could do. She threw herself between her children and the men. She screamed for her boys to run, though where they could have run, she did not know. She raised her arms as though her soft frame could somehow shield 3 small bodies from what was coming. Salvatore's car struck 2 of the men. The bodyguard shot a 3rd. But the 4th man, the largest, reached Elena, and she felt his hand close on her arm, and she felt herself being lifted off her feet, and she heard Luca screaming, "Mama, Mama," and Matteo crying, and Nico kicking the man's shin with his small, furious foot, and then she heard something else. She heard a voice, calm. Terrifyingly calm. Slow-burning velvet. Put her down. Elena turned her head. Dante was standing in the middle of the street. He had come from nowhere. He was not holding a weapon. He was simply standing there, in a black coat, his hands loose at his sides. And behind him were 15 men in identical black coats, and behind them were 3 more black cars. And above them, on every rooftop, Elena could suddenly see the silhouettes of men she had not known were there. The silent king had unleashed his empire. The man holding Elena froze. He looked at Dante. He looked at the 15 men. He looked at the rooftops. And Elena saw in his eyes the exact moment he understood that he was already dead. "Put her down," Dante said, again softly, almost gently. The man put her down. "Step away from the children." The man stepped away from the children. "Kneel." The man knelt. Elena scrambled backward, gathering her sons into her arms, all 3 of them at once, pressing their faces into her shoulder so they would not have to see what was about to happen. But nothing violent happened. Nothing at all. Dante simply walked forward, past the kneeling man, and knelt himself in front of Elena and the boys. He touched Elena's face with a hand that shook only slightly. He looked at each of his sons in turn, checking them for injuries. And finding none, he closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against Luca's. Then he stood. He turned to Raphael, who had appeared silently at his side, and he said, only 3 words. "Activate Black Protocol." Raphael nodded. He lifted a phone. He spoke into it once. And within the next 6 hours, every single business, Every single shell company, every single asset, every single hidden dollar, and every single loyal man in Alessandro Bianchi's 20-year-old organization was systematically, ruthlessly, and completely dismantled. Not with bombs, not with guns, but with something far more devastating in the modern world. Court filings, frozen accounts, leaked documents, federal warrants, public exposure, whispers in the right ears. Money moved to the right authorities. By midnight, Alessandro Bianchi's empire had collapsed. By dawn, Alessandro Bianchi himself was in federal custody, arrested on evidence so airtight that his own lawyers refused to represent him. And by the following afternoon, the man who had spent 20 years plotting his return had been quietly, permanently, unmistakably erased from the world of men who mattered. Elena had not seen any of it. Elena had been carried back to the brownstone in Dante's arms, her 3 boys clinging to both of them, and she had spent that night in Dante's arms on the couch in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, drinking tea, while Raphael made phone calls in the kitchen and Salvatore stood watch at the door. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the boys were asleep upstairs and the fire in the fireplace had burned down to embers, Elena had looked up at Dante and said, "Tell me everything. All of it. From the beginning. I want to know who I love." And Dante Moretti, the silent king, who had never in his life spoken more than he needed to, sat with the woman he loved and told her every single thing. About his father, about the organization, about the choices he had made and the ones he had refused to make, about the man he was trying to become, about the man he wanted to be, for her, for their sons. Elena listened. And when he was finished, she said, "Only I love you, Dante Moretti. I have loved you for 6 years. I was too afraid to say it before. I am not afraid anymore." He wept. This time, not silently. This time, with his whole broken, mending heart. And Elena Russo held him, this powerful, terrible, gentle man, in her soft, warm, generous arms. And she did not let go. 6 months later, on a soft afternoon in late spring, the Aveline Bloom's flower shop on the Upper East Side reopened under new ownership. Its name was changed. The new sign, in gold letters on white marble, read Elena's Garden. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was the phrase, "For every unseen gem." The shop was owned, entirely and without partners, by Elena Russo. It had been given to her, deed and all, as an opening gift by her fiancé, who had also personally hired every single employee, arranged every single supplier contract, and made certain that the shop would run as a genuine business, but one which Elena could step into or out of as she pleased, with 3 small boys who needed their mother. On the day of the opening, the small street was closed to traffic. A crowd had gathered. Reporters, friends, family, and a great many people from a great many walks of life, whose lives had been quietly, discreetly, touched by Moretti kindness over the past 6 months. Because Dante Moretti, in the wake of the Bianchi affair, had done something no one in his family had ever done before. He had begun, publicly, transparently, and with the full cooperation of federal authorities, the process of transitioning the last shadowy elements of his organization into legitimate, licensed enterprises with a foundation for underprivileged families, run by Elena as its cornerstone. Elena stood in front of the shop in a soft cream dress that hugged her curves without apology. Her 3 boys in tiny matching suits at her side. And she looked out at the crowd and she smiled. Dante stepped forward. He held a small velvet box. He did not kneel, not yet. "Elena Russo," he said. His voice carried without a microphone because the street had gone silent. 6 years ago, I walked into a flower shop looking for white peonies, and I found something far more precious. I have loved you, in silence, in absence, and in presence, every day since. I have 3 sons because of you. I have a life because of you, and I have a soul, at last, because of you. He knelt. Marry me. Please. Elena did not answer right away. She looked down at her 3 boys, who were nodding vigorously, as though their opinion had been the only remaining question. She looked at Dante. She looked at the crowd. And she said, in a voice that was no longer small, no longer apologetic, no longer the voice of a woman who took up less space than she deserved. Yes, the crowd erupted. Nico, the bold one, threw his small hands in the air and shouted, finally. Luca, the eldest, hugged his mother's leg. Matteo, the quiet one, walked up to Dante and very solemnly patted him on the shoulder. Raphael Colombo, standing to one side, wiped a suspicious moisture from his eye and muttered something about allergies. And Dante Moretti, once the silent king, once the man whose name made hardened men whisper in cathedrals, rose to his feet and kissed the woman he had spent 5 years searching for in the middle of a Manhattan street, in front of God and every reporter in the city, and he did not care who saw. They were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony in the garden of the brownstone. Elena wore a dress her grandmother had once worn, tailored to fit her lovingly, and she carried a bouquet of white peonies. The 3 boys walked her down the aisle, one on each side and one leading the way, because they had refused to be assigned individual roles and had instead voted democratically to do all the jobs at once. Raphael Colombo was the best man. He gave a speech in which he claimed, straight-faced, that Dante Moretti had once been the most terrifying man in the Western world and had now been reduced by 4 small people to a soft, sentimental fool who kept a crayon drawing in his suit pocket at all times. The crowd laughed. Dante did not deny it. Elena's best friend from Portland, a bright, cheerful woman named Camille, who had helped her raise the boys during the hardest years, was the maid of honor. She cried through the entire ceremony and hugged Dante afterward with such fierce loyalty that even he, master strategist and stoic king, seemed slightly overwhelmed. The reception was held in the garden. There was music and dancing and small children running through the flower beds, and Elena Russo, now Elena Moretti, danced barefoot on the grass with her husband while their 3 sons chased fireflies around them. And Dante Moretti, watching his wife laugh in the golden light, felt, for the first time in his life, that he had built something worth all the power he possessed. That, in the end, was the truth of it. That was the moral of the long, strange story of the silent king and the unseen gem. That power, without love, is only weight. That wealth, without family, is only paper. That the greatest empires in the world are worth nothing at all. Next to the small, warm hand of a child, or the soft, trusting smile of a woman who has chosen you, not for what you have, but for who you are, when everything else is stripped away. Elena Russo had once been a woman who apologized for taking up space. She had ended as a woman who filled a room and a garden and a life with warmth and light and unshakable love. She had learned, at last, that she had always been enough, that she had always been beautiful, that she had always been seen. And Dante Moretti, the man who had once believed that silence was the highest form of strength, had learned that the strongest words a man could ever speak were the simplest ones. I love you. I need you. Please stay. Please come home. They had 3 more children in the years that followed, a daughter, first, whom they named Grace, then twin girls, whom they named Rose and Lily. The brownstone in the West Village became far too small, and they moved to a larger house upstate, with a garden that Elena tended herself, and a flower shop in the nearest town that she visited twice a week. Luca grew up to be a quiet, thoughtful boy, who wanted to be a doctor. Matteo became a musician. Nico, the bold one, announced at age 8 that he would one day take over his father's business, and Dante had only smiled and said, "We will see. My son, we will see." The Moretti Foundation, run by Elena, grew year by year. It funded flower shops in poor neighborhoods, and small business grants for single mothers, and scholarships for children who had grown up, as Elena had, in small apartments above small shops, believing themselves invisible. Every year on the anniversary of the day they had found each other again. In that quiet cafe on the Upper East Side, Dante Moretti sent his wife a dozen white peonies. And every year Elena Moretti opened them, and she smiled, and she wept a little, and she remembered how close they had come to losing everything, and how loudly, at last, the silence between them had learned to speak. And that, dear listener, was the story of the Mafia boss who sipped his coffee in peace until he glimpsed his ex with 3 matching sons, and understood, in a single terrible, wonderful instant, that his empire had never been the one he thought he was building. His empire had always been her. It had always been them. It had always been love.